the forbidden book they didn't want you to read. What if I told you there's an ancient book that was banned from the Bible? A book so mysterious that only a few religious groups dared to preserve it. The Book of Jubilees claims to reveal hidden secrets about angels, lost history, and divine prophecies, but for centuries it has been kept out of mainstream religious teachings. Why was it removed? What secrets does it hold? And most importantly, were we meant to find it? In this video, we'll uncover the shocking truths inside the Book of Jubilees, explore why it was banned, and ask the question, was this knowledge too dangerous for the world to know? If you love uncovering hidden history, biblical mysteries, and forbidden knowledge, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. And don't forget to drop a comment. Do you think the Book of Jubilees was suppressed on purpose, or was it just lost to time? Let's dive in. Imagine this. What if the way we understand time, law, and even our own destiny has been hiding in an ancient text that most people have never even heard of? A book so old, so mysterious, and yet so crucial that it could completely change the way we see the world. Now we all know about the Bible, the stories of creation, the flood, Moses, and the 10 Commandments. These are familiar to many. But what if I told you there was another book, one that dives even deeper, one that claims to reveal the very blueprint of time itself? This is the Book of Jubilees, a text that has been called everything from a lost piece of sacred scripture to an overlooked relic of religious history. And today, we're going to uncover its secrets. This isn't just another ancient manuscript. The Book of Jubilees lays out a cosmic calendar, a divine timeline that suggests history is unfolding according to a preordained structure set by God from the very beginning. It speaks of angels revealing hidden wisdom, of events playing out in cycles of 49-year periods, jubilees that supposedly shape the fate of the world. But why was this book forgotten? Who wrote it? And what could it mean for the way we understand history, prophecy, and even the laws that govern our lives? If you've ever wondered about the missing pieces of biblical history, or if you love unraveling ancient mysteries, you're in for something special. Because the Book of Jubilees doesn't just recount familiar stories, it reinterprets them. It gives us an alternative perspective on Genesis, Exodus, and the origins of God's law, filling in details that the traditional Bible leaves out. Could this be the missing link to understanding the divine plan? Or is it a forgotten text that was meant to remain in the shadows? Did you know that time itself might be running on a schedule, one that was set in motion at the very beginning of creation? Not just days, months, and years as we know them, but an entire system of timekeeping that follows a divine pattern, ticking away like a cosmic clock designed by God. The Book of Jubilees introduces something truly mind-blowing. The idea that history unfolds in cycles of 49 years, known as jubilees. This isn't just a random way of marking time. It's a sacred structure woven into the fabric of creation itself. According to this ancient text, God didn't just create the heavens and the earth. He created time, measured and organized in perfect cycles, each spanning 7 sets of 7 years. Think of it as the divine blueprint for history, where everything significant happens in these ordained intervals. Now, if this sounds familiar, you might recognize the echoes of this idea in the Bible, especially in the concept of the Sabbath. We all know about the 7th day of rest, the Sabbath, a holy day set apart by God. But the Book of Jubilees expands this idea far beyond a single day of the week. It tells us that time itself follows this sacred rhythm, with the same principle applying to weeks, years, and even entire ages of history. 7 days make a week. 7 weeks lead to a special festival. 7 years form a cycle of rest for the land. And when you multiply that by 7, boom, you get a full jubilee, a moment when debts are forgiven, captives are freed, and a new chapter begins. And here's where it gets even more intriguing. According to Jubilees, God didn't just create the world in 6 days and rest on the 7th. He established this pattern for all time, meaning that every major event, every rise and fall of nations, every divine intervention is part of a preordained cycle. Think of it like a celestial calendar, a master plan that humanity is unknowingly following, step by step, jubilee by jubilee. But why does this matter? Well, if time itself is structured by divine design, then history isn't just a random series of events. It's a story being told in perfect rhythm, chapter by chapter, right up to the present day. The implications of this are huge. It means that the world isn't just moving forward in chaos. There's order, intention, and prophecy built into the very timeline of existence. And here's the big question. If these cycles truly shape history, could they also reveal what's to come? If the past has followed this divine schedule, is the future already set in place, waiting for us to reach the next Jubilee moment? That's exactly what we're going to explore next. Because once you start seeing history through the lens of the Book of Jubilees, it changes everything. If the Book of Jubilees is right, then something we've always assumed about God's law might be completely wrong, or at least incomplete. Most of us think of the 10 Commandments and the laws given to Moses on Mount Sinai as the moment when God officially laid down the rules for humanity. But what if those laws weren't new at all? What if they had been in place since the very beginning of time, long before Moses, before Israel, even before sin entered the world? According to Jubilees, God's laws aren't just commandments given to one nation at one moment in history. They are eternal, woven into creation itself, observed not just by humans, but even by the angels in heaven. That means things like the Sabbath, the rules about clean and unclean foods, and other moral codes weren't first introduced to humanity at Sinai. They had been followed since the days of Adam and Eve, since Noah, since Abraham. This changes everything, because if God's law was always there, then it's not just for one people or one time period. It's universal, timeless. The Book of Jubilees claims that when God created the world, he also established his law as part of the cosmic order. Angels in heaven, the highest beings in creation, were already following these divine instructions long before they were ever written on stone tablets for Moses. Imagine that. The very same commandments that later defined the Jewish people were, according to this book, the laws of the universe itself, practiced in heaven and given to humans as a gift, not just as a restriction. And if that's true, it raises an even bigger question. What does this mean for us today? If these laws were not just rules for an ancient nation, but part of the very fabric of creation, does that mean they still apply to all of humanity? Were they never meant to change, never meant to be discarded or altered? Take the Sabbath, for example. In most Christian traditions, it's seen as something given to the Israelites, a commandment for their nation. But Jubilees says that the Sabbath was set apart from the very beginning of time. God himself rested on the seventh day and commanded not just people, but all of creation, even the angels, to do the same. This wasn't just a cultural rule. It was a rhythm of time itself, part of the same divine cycles that govern the universe. And then there's the idea of clean and unclean foods. Most people assume these rules started with Moses and were meant only for ancient Israel. But according to Jubilees, Noah, yes, Noah, already knew about them. After the flood, when Noah stepped onto dry land and made a sacrifice to God, he didn't just offer any animal. He specifically chose from the clean animals, the ones that, according to later biblical laws, would be considered acceptable. How did he know? Because Jubilees tells us these laws had existed long before him, passed down as part of divine knowledge since the dawn of time. So here's the real mystery. If these laws were established before Sinai, before Israel, even before written scripture, then what does that tell us about the timeless nature of God's commandments? Were they meant for all people, in all ages? Are they still relevant today? Or did something change along the way? These are the kinds of questions that shake up the way we think about faith, history, and even our own place in the grand design of the universe. And the answers might just be hiding in the lost pages of ancient wisdom. If there's one figure who stands at the crossroads of history, connecting faith, destiny, and divine promise, it's Abraham. He's often called the father of nations, the patriarch of Israel, and a man of incredible faith. But according to the Book of Jubilees, there's more to his story than what most people know. The Bible tells us that Abraham was chosen by God, called out from his homeland, and given a covenant that would change the course of history. But what if I told you that his journey of faith began much earlier than we thought? According to Jubilees, Abraham didn't just stumble into God's favor. He was set apart from birth, protected by divine intervention, and guided by hidden knowledge long before his famous encounter with God in Canaan. In fact, the Book of Jubilees reveals that Abraham was questioning the world around him from a very young age. It describes how, as a child, he looked at the stars, the sun, and the moon, and realized that these celestial bodies couldn't possibly be gods, as the people around him believed. While others worshipped idols, Abraham rejected them, recognizing that there had to be one true creator behind everything. And that realization, it put him on a collision course with the culture he was born into. Jubilees even adds a dramatic twist to his early years, one that sounds eerily similar to the story of Moses. According to this text, the ruler of Abraham's homeland, King Nimrod, saw him as a threat from birth. Nimrod, who is often linked to the Tower of Babel, is portrayed in Jubilees as a powerful, oppressive king who didn't take kindly to challengers. When he heard that a child had been born who would one day rise against idol worship and change the world, he tried to have Abraham killed. Sound familiar? It's a theme we see throughout the Bible. Divine destinies threatened by worldly rulers, from Moses in Egypt to Jesus in Bethlehem. But just like in those stories, God had other plans. Abraham's family hid him, and he grew up away from Nimrod's reach, learning wisdom and preparing for the role he would eventually play. And then comes the moment that changes everything. Abraham's covenant with God. The Bible tells us about God's promise to him, that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars, that he would inherit a great land, and that through him all nations would be blessed. But Jubilees gives us even more details about this sacred agreement. It describes how the covenant wasn't just a verbal promise. It was an eternal decree, written down on heavenly tablets and observed by the angels. In other words, this wasn't just a personal blessing for Abraham. This was part of a divine master plan, something set in motion before time itself. And here's where things get even deeper. According to Jubilees, Abraham didn't just receive the law in a vague or distant way. He actually studied it. The book claims that he was given knowledge of God's commandments long before Moses, long before Sinai. He kept the Sabbath. He followed the dietary laws. He lived according to the principles that would later define Israel. All because he had insight into God's eternal design. This means that Abraham wasn't just the biological father of many nations. He was also a spiritual father, a model of faith and obedience long before the law was officially given. His story in Jubilees is a testament to the idea that God's plan was unfolding in precise detail, according to the cycles of time, long before history even recognized it. And that brings us to the bigger picture, the fulfillment of divine promises. If Abraham's story was preordained, if his role was written into the fabric of time, then what does that say about the rest of history? Could it be that the major events of our world, the rise and fall of nations, the turning points of human civilization, are all part of a cosmic schedule that has been ticking away since creation? The Book of Jubilees suggests that nothing happens by chance, that divine promises are fulfilled exactly when they're meant to be, according to the cycles of time established by God. And if that's true, then we have to ask, where are we in that timeline right now? Are we approaching another turning point, another Jubilee moment that will redefine history as we know it? That's a question we'll keep exploring, because if there's one thing the Book of Jubilees makes clear, it's that the past, the present, and the future are all connected, and we might be closer to the next great chapter than we realize. The story of Jacob and Esau is one of the most dramatic, tension-filled sagas in the Bible. Two brothers, born minutes apart, locked in a struggle over inheritance, identity, and destiny. But if you think you know the whole story, the Book of Jubilees might surprise you. Most people remember the key moments. Esau, the rugged hunter, sells his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of stew, and later Jacob, with his mother Rebekah's help, tricks their father Isaac into giving him the final blessing. It's a tale of rivalry, deception, and divine fate. But Jubilees fills in the gaps, giving us a deeper look at Esau's character, his choices, and why this ancient struggle was about more than just family drama. It was about the spiritual forces shaping history itself. According to Jubilees, Esau wasn't just an impulsive, hungry older brother who made a bad trade in the heat of the moment. He was someone who had already made a habit of disregarding what was sacred. The text describes him as a man who lived for the moment, someone who followed his own desires instead of thinking about the long-term weight of God's promises. It even goes so far as to say that he had no real respect for the covenant that had been passed down from Abraham to Isaac. And this is where things get interesting, because in Jubilees, Jacob's role isn't just about trickery or clever maneuvering. It's about divine selection. The book suggests that Jacob was always meant to carry the birthright, that he was chosen from the start. This wasn't just a case of one brother outsmarting the other. It was a battle between two different destinies. Jacob, the quiet, thoughtful man who stayed close to home, was in tune with God's ways. Esau, the wild hunter, was ruled by impulse and earthly desires. The Book of Jubilees makes it clear that this wasn't just about who was born first. It was about who valued the things of God. And then comes the blessing. In the biblical account, Isaac, old and nearly blind, prepares to give his final blessing to Esau, believing him to be the rightful heir. But Rebekah steps in, helping Jacob disguise himself as Esau to receive the blessing instead. On the surface it looks like deception, but Jubilees adds another layer to the story, one that suggests Rebekah wasn't acting out of favoritism or selfish ambition. She knew. According to this text, she had received a divine revelation that Jacob was meant to inherit the blessing all along. This wasn't just a mother helping her favorite son. It was a woman acting in alignment with God's plan. Of course, Esau doesn't take this well. He's furious, not just at Jacob, but at their parents too. And here's where Jubilees adds a twist that many people don't know about. The text says that Esau wasn't just angry, he was ready to kill. And not just in a fit of rage. He actually made a plan, a calculated decision to take Jacob's life after their father passed away. But Rebekah saw it coming, and she sent Jacob away to safety, setting the stage for the next chapter of his life. So what does this ancient story really teach us? It's not just about sibling rivalry. It's about choices and consequences. Esau had every opportunity to embrace his birthright, to walk in the path of Abraham and Isaac. But time and again he chose the temporary over the eternal. He lived for the moment, and in doing so, he lost something far greater than a blessing. He lost his place in the divine story. And what about Jacob? His journey wasn't easy. He faced struggles, exile, and years of hardship. But through it all, he remained connected to God's plan, and in the end, he became the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, the nation that would carry God's promise forward. The story of Jacob and Esau is more than ancient history. It's a mirror that forces us to ask ourselves, what kind of choices are we making? Are we living for what is temporary, or are we thinking about the bigger picture? Are we valuing what is truly sacred, or are we trading away our future for something as fleeting as a bowl of stew? Jacob's story doesn't end with his personal struggles. It expands into something much bigger. From one man, an entire nation was born. The 12 tribes of Israel weren't just a large family. They became the foundation of God's chosen people, a living testimony to the covenant made with Abraham. But according to the Book of Jubilees, their destiny wasn't just about history. It was about the future. And if we pay close attention, we might see that these tribes still hold significance in prophecy, even today. The Bible tells us how Jacob's 12 sons became the heads of the tribes, each one playing a role in shaping Israel's identity. But Jubilees gives us extra details, shedding light on their individual destinies, the blessings they received, and the unique characteristics that set them apart. It paints a picture of a divine plan unfolding, where each tribe wasn't just a family unit, but a part of a grander design, a puzzle piece in the structure of God's kingdom. For example, the tribe of Levi, the priestly tribe, wasn't chosen randomly. Jubilees makes it clear that their role as spiritual leaders was foreseen long before the days of Moses. Their ancestors, including Abraham and Jacob himself, were already practicing and understanding God's laws, even before they were written down at Sinai. Levi's lineage was set apart from the beginning to be guardians of God's law, teachers of righteousness, and keepers of the sacred traditions. Then there's Judah, the tribe that would one day bring forth kings, including David and eventually Jesus. According to Jubilees, Judah's role as a leader wasn't just political, it was part of a prophetic timeline. His descendants were meant to rule, to bring justice, and ultimately to fulfill a messianic promise that would extend far beyond the borders of Israel. And let's not forget the other tribes. Reuben, the firstborn who lost his place due to dishonor. Joseph, whose journey from slavery to power in Egypt became a foreshadowing of salvation, and the lesser-known tribes, each carrying a destiny that contributed to the greater whole. Jubilees emphasizes that these weren't just historical figures. They were living symbols of a deeper spiritual reality, representing different aspects of God's plan for humanity. But here's where things get really interesting. If the tribes of Israel were so central to history, what happened to them? Some, like Judah and Levi, remained identifiable throughout history, but others seem to disappear, scattered among the nations. Are they truly lost, or is there a deeper mystery at play? Jubilees hints at something profound, that the 12 tribes were never meant to just exist in the past. Their legacy continues, and their role in God's divine plan isn't over. Could it be that they still have a purpose in the events leading up to the end times? Could the so-called lost tribes have a part to play in the fulfillment of prophecy? This is where ancient history meets modern mystery, because if these tribes are still significant, then the covenant made with Abraham, the promise passed down through Jacob, and the destiny of God's chosen people, it all still matters today. And if the cycles of time established in the Book of Jubilees are still unfolding, then we might be closer than we think to the next chapter in this incredible story. So where does that leave us? If the tribes of Israel are more than just names in an old book, if their fate is tied to prophecy and the ultimate fulfillment of God's plan, then understanding their story isn't just about history, it's about the future. And the next step in that journey might be happening right now. Joseph's story is one of the most extraordinary in all of history, a tale of betrayal, resilience, and divine orchestration that not only changed his own life, but set the stage for an entire nation's destiny. We often focus on Joseph's personal journey, how he was sold into slavery by his own brothers, thrown into prison on false charges, and then miraculously elevated to the second most powerful position in Egypt. But according to the Book of Jubilees, this wasn't just a story of one man's rise to power. It was a carefully designed plan, a sequence of events set in motion long before Joseph ever set foot in Egypt, all leading to something much bigger, the eventual deliverance of Israel. The betrayal by Joseph's brothers wasn't just a random act of jealousy. Jubilees gives deeper insight into the family dynamics at play, showing that the tensions between Joseph and his older brothers had been brewing for years. They saw him as their father's favorite, but more than that, they were unsettled by his dreams, visions that seemed to hint at a destiny far greater than theirs. To them, selling Joseph into slavery was a way to rid themselves of a rival. But what they didn't realize was that they were actually playing right into God's plan. Jubilees portrays Joseph's faithfulness in a powerful way, emphasizing how, even in the darkest moments, he remained committed to God. In Potiphar's house, when he was falsely accused and thrown into prison, he never lost faith. In prison, when he was abandoned and forgotten by those he helped, he still trusted in God's timing. And when Pharaoh called upon him to interpret dreams, something that would change his life forever, he didn't take credit for his gift. He acknowledged that it was God alone who revealed the truth. And this is where things get truly fascinating. Joseph's rise to power wasn't just a personal victory. It was the beginning of something much bigger. As famine struck the land, forcing his brothers to come to Egypt in search of food, a divine cycle was playing out, one that would bring reconciliation, redemption, and a major shift in history. Jubilees highlights that Joseph's reunion with his family wasn't just about healing old wounds. It was the start of a prophetic movement. By bringing his brothers, their families, and eventually his aging father Jacob into Egypt, Joseph was unknowingly setting the stage for what would become one of the most defining events in Israel's history, the Exodus. Think about it. If Joseph had never been sold into slavery, if he had never been imprisoned, if he had never risen to power, then his family would have never come to Egypt in the first place. There would have been no growing Israelite population in Egypt, no Pharaoh who turned against them, and no need for Moses to rise up and lead them to freedom. Everything, the years of suffering, the trials, the betrayals, had been leading to a much greater purpose. But here's where it gets even deeper. Jubilees suggest that Joseph wasn't just a man caught in a whirlwind of circumstances. He was part of a divine plan set into motion long before his birth. His trials weren't just tests. They were necessary steps in a grand design, shaping him into the leader who would preserve God's people. And his faithfulness through it all wasn't just about personal character. It was about aligning himself with God's timing, trusting that even in the worst moments, something greater was happening behind the scenes. And so we have to ask ourselves, how often do we see struggle as pointless? How often do we look at hardship and wonder where God is? Joseph's story, and the way Jubilees frames it, reminds us that sometimes what feels like a detour is actually the main road. Sometimes the suffering we endure is not an obstacle to God's plan. It's the very thing that leads us to it. Joseph's journey didn't end with his personal success. It set the foundation for an entire nation's destiny. And as we continue this journey through Jubilees, one question remains. If Joseph's trials led to the salvation of Israel, what comes next? Because the next chapter in this divine story, the Exodus, is about to unfold, and the echoes of Joseph's faithfulness will be felt for generations to come. The Israelites' time in Egypt didn't begin in chains. When Joseph brought his family to Egypt, they arrived as honored guests, given some of the best land in Goshen. They prospered, multiplied, and became a mighty people. But over time, everything changed. A new Pharaoh rose to power, one who had no memory of Joseph's contributions, no respect for the history that had led the Israelites to Egypt. And just like that, a people who once lived in prosperity found themselves shackled in slavery. But according to the Book of Jubilees, this wasn't just political oppression. This was a spiritual trial, a test of endurance, and a necessary step in God's divine plan. The suffering of the Israelites wasn't meaningless. It was a season of refining, a period that would strengthen them as a nation and prepare them for the freedom that lay ahead. Jubilees offers a perspective that goes beyond the usual telling of the story. It suggests that the growing hardship wasn't just the result of Pharaoh's fear of their numbers. It was allowed by God as a way of shaping his people. The Israelites had been in Egypt for generations, and over time they had become influenced by the customs, culture, and even the beliefs of the land around them. Enslavement forced them to remember who they truly were. It pushed them to cry out to God, to long for the promise made to Abraham, and to seek deliverance with a desperation they might not have had if life in Egypt had remained easy. And yet even in their suffering, God's hand was at work. The harsher their oppression, the more they grew. The more Pharaoh tried to break them, the more resilient they became. This was no accident. Jubilees makes it clear that even though the Israelites couldn't see it at the time, they were being prepared for something far greater than just an escape from Egypt. They were being prepared to become a holy nation. Think about it. Every great transformation comes with struggle. Before freedom, there is hardship. Before deliverance, there is trial. The Israelites were not just waiting for rescue. They were being shaped into a people who would be ready to receive the law, to carry the covenant forward, and to inherit the land promised to their ancestors. And as their cries for deliverance grew louder, something was already set in motion. A baby was about to be born. A leader was about to rise. The next chapter of the story, the Great Exodus, was about to begin. And as we continue exploring the hidden layers of this story through the Book of Jubilees, one question lingers. How did God prepare his people for freedom? Because as history shows, being set free is one thing, but learning how to walk in that freedom, that's something else entirely. The moment at Mount Sinai is one of the most pivotal in all of history. After generations of slavery, after witnessing miracles in Egypt, and walking through the Red Sea on dry ground, the Israelites found themselves standing at the foot of a mountain, waiting to hear from God. It was here that they received the law, the divine instructions that would shape them into a holy nation. But according to the Book of Jubilees, this law wasn't something new. It wasn't just a reaction to their time in Egypt. It was part of a plan that had been in place from the very beginning. Jubilees offers a perspective that makes the giving of the law at Sinai feel less like a sudden moment in time, and more like the unveiling of something eternal. It presents the law not as a random set of rules, but as a divine order woven into creation itself. According to this text, the laws given to Moses had already been observed in heaven. Angels followed them. The patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, lived by them long before they were formally written down. Even Adam, the very first man, was aware of certain divine commands. In other words, the law wasn't just a legal code. It was the blueprint for living in harmony with God's will. This changes everything, because if the law wasn't just for the Israelites in that particular moment, but was part of an eternal design, then its purpose wasn't just about rules. It was about alignment. It was about teaching people how to live in a way that reflected the order of heaven. Every command, every statute, every instruction given at Sinai was meant to bring humanity closer to God, to teach them how to walk in righteousness, and to protect them from the chaos of a world disconnected from divine truth. Consider the Sabbath. In the traditional biblical account, the Sabbath was introduced at Sinai as a day of rest. But Jubilees reveals that the Sabbath was observed from the beginning of time, kept by the angels before humanity even existed. This suggests that resting on the seventh day wasn't just a cultural practice for Israel. It was an invitation to participate in something much greater, to step into the rhythm of creation itself. The dietary laws, the festivals, the moral commands, Jubilees portrays them not as burdens but as pathways. Pathways to holiness, to wisdom, to a life that mirrors the perfection of heaven. And when seen in this light, the law becomes less about restriction and more about transformation. But here's where it gets really interesting. If the law existed before Sinai, if it was part of God's eternal plan, then what does that mean for its relevance today? Was it only meant for Israel, or does it carry significance beyond that? And if the law was given as a gift, not just to control people, but to guide them toward a higher way of living, then what does that say about the way we approach divine instruction now? The Book of Jubilees challenges us to see Mount Sinai not just as a historical moment, but as a revelation of something deeper, a divine pattern, a glimpse into the structure of God's kingdom. And as the Israelites stood at the mountain, receiving this sacred blueprint, they weren't just being given laws. They were being invited into a covenant, a calling to live in a way that reflected the order and holiness of the Creator himself. But even with a divine blueprint, humanity struggles. The Israelites had the law, they had the covenant, they had the promise. But would they be able to keep it? Because as history unfolds, we see a pattern emerge. People receiving God's instructions, then drifting away, then finding their way back again. The question isn't just whether they could follow the law. The real question is, how would they stay faithful to it? And that's where the next chapter of this journey begins. The Book of Jubilees isn't just a retelling of history. It's a roadmap to the future. Tucked within its pages are prophecies that go beyond the stories of the patriarchs and the giving of the law. It speaks of things yet to come, of cycles repeating, of a divine plan that stretches to the very end of time. And if we pay attention, we might find that its vision of the future is closer to unfolding than we ever imagined. One of the central themes in Jubilees is the idea that history moves in divinely ordained cycles, Jubilees of 49 years each, marking out the appointed times for key events in God's plan. This isn't just a symbolic structure, it's a pattern woven into the fabric of time itself. According to this ancient text, everything is happening according to schedule. From the creation of the world to the rise and fall of nations, from Israel's trials to its eventual restoration, history is not random. It's following a script written long ago. And that brings us to prophecy. Jubilees doesn't just hint at the struggles Israel would face. It lays out a vision of the future, warning of periods of rebellion, judgment, and ultimately, redemption. It foretells a time when people would turn away from God's laws, when corruption and sin would increase, when the covenant would be broken. But it doesn't end with despair, because just as judgment is part of the pattern, so is restoration. Jubilees speaks of a future time when God will set things right, when justice will be served, when the faithful will be vindicated, and when those who have walked in righteousness will inherit the blessings promised long ago. It describes a final judgment, where those who have rebelled against God's ways will be held accountable, but also a time of renewal, when the righteous will be rewarded and the kingdom of God will be fully established. And then there's Israel. The Book of Jubilees makes it clear that the destiny of God's people isn't finished. Though they have been scattered, though they have endured trials and exile, their story isn't over. A time will come when Israel will be gathered again, when the covenant will be fully restored, and when they will once again walk in the fullness of God's promises. It's a vision of hope, of fulfillment, of a future where the struggles of the past finally give way to the glory of what's to come. So what does all this mean for us today? If history is moving in cycles, if prophecy is unfolding even now, then we are part of this story. The struggles we see in the world, the conflicts, the moral decay, the longing for justice, all of it fits into the grand design laid out in texts like Jubilees. And if that's true, then we have a choice. Will we align ourselves with God's plan? Will we walk in righteousness, knowing that the final chapter has already been written? The Book of Jubilees reminds us that history is not just a collection of events. It's a journey toward a promised future. And as we move closer to the fulfillment of that promise, the question remains, are we ready? Because the end of one cycle is always the beginning of the next, and the greatest chapter of all may be just around the corner. So why does all of this matter today? Why should we care about an ancient book that many people have never even heard of? The truth is, the Book of Jubilees isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a key to understanding the bigger picture of God's plan, from creation to prophecy, from law to redemption. It shows us that time itself is not random, that the laws given to Moses were part of a divine design from the beginning, and that history moves in cycles leading toward a final fulfillment. Through the stories of Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, and the Israelites, we see patterns that still play out in the world today. Struggles of faith, choices that shape destinies, periods of hardship that prepare us for something greater. The enslavement of Israel was not just about oppression. It was a season of refinement. The giving of the law was not just about rules. It was about aligning with God's eternal order. And the prophecies of the end times remind us that the story isn't over yet. If history truly follows a divine script, then we are living in a chapter of that story right now. The choices we make, the way we live, the way we respond to the truth, these all matter, because just like the people of the past, we are being shaped for what comes next. So, what do you think about these revelations? Do the insights from the Book of Jubilees change the way you see biblical history? And what do you think they say about where we are today? Let's keep this conversation going. Drop your thoughts in the comments below.